Chapter 34 Growing Pains 3 times had New York gone into war, and always reluctantly. Now, for the 3rd time, the city emerged from conflict, and, just as in the 2 earlier cases, with unexpected gains. Each struggle had registered its own peculiar change in the city's life. The close of the Revolutionary War gave New York the commercial, financial, and for a time the political leadership of the new nation, while after the War of 1812 there followed clipper ship supremacy that poured wealth into its coffers. The Civil War left an even greater impress. Wall Street had been an important battlefield of the Civil War. Here had originated the plans for advertising the sale of government bonds to meet the expenses of the conflict. And from Wall Street, President Lincoln had called John A. Stuart to be Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. American leadership in the ocean-carrying trade was gone, but in its place came a tremendous urge toward internal development. The country entered an age of machines, of factories, and particularly of railroad expansion. At the close of the war, therefore, when nationwide development called for financing on a huge scale, Wall Street became the natural center for such activity. Business became extremely active, and there arose financial giants who entered eagerly into the task of piecing together small, privately owned railroads into colossal systems. Such men as Vanderbilt, Huntington, Gould, and Fisk, and, in more recent years, Hill and Harriman. Safe and sound stock investments mingled on the market with much furious and precarious gambling. Fortunes were made and lost. But through it all, the growth of the railroads proceeded rapidly, opening up new regions to travel and commerce and bringing prosperity to many sections of the country. Side by side with this stimulus to commerce, a certain amount of demoralization followed the Civil War, and this showed most intensively in New York City, because here business intensity is greatest. People felt that the day of small things had come to an end, and that the day of opportunity had arrived. To some, this meant constructive enterprise of lasting benefit to the country, but to many others, it meant a chance to make some big killings. In the fall of 1869, one such predatory group conceived the idea of cornering the gold market, and quietly began buying in all the specie. Everything was proceeding merrily. The price of gold was being forced up and up to giddy, dangerous heights. And then suddenly, between 11:50 a.m. and 12:11 p.m. on September 24th, prices crashed amid wildest confusion. This disastrous day, on which thousands of speculators were ruined, became known as Black Friday, and it was not learned until years later that Henry Clews, alarmed at the reckless actions of the pool, had sent a telegram to President Grant asking him to act. The president's response had been the release of $5 million in gold, an amount sufficient to smash the pool. In many other instances of lawless raiding, particularly in railroad stocks, the unscrupulous speculator had his own way quite unchecked. Between the bulls and the bears thus turned wolves, the lambs suffered. However, it was in politics even more than in finance that the city's growing pains were felt. New York City government fell into the hands of a new type of buccaneer. Under Boss Tweed and his ring of pirates, distinguishable by waxed mustaches and large diamond stick pins rather than sashes and daggers, the cost of public improvements rose to astonishing figures. In the construction of the new county courthouse, which still stands on the northern part of City Hall Park, the most brazen profits were taken by the ring. $641,000 was charged for its carpets, $1,937,545 for plastering and frescoing, and $2,960,187 for furniture and cabinet work, and similar amounts for other items. Finally, when the corrupt rule had cost the taxpayers about $160 million, the city grew wary of walking the plank. George Jones, the editor of the New York Times, Thomas Nast, the famous cartoonist of Harper's Weekly, and Samuel J. Tilden, founder of the New York Bar Association, led a vigorous attack on the political bandits and overthrew them. Boss Tweed died in jail. That New York grew steadily through all the years of feverish speculation and political corruption is further proof of its high commercial destiny. The city had passed the million mark in population, and there was a great demand for rapid transit on the long and narrow island of Manhattan. To meet this situation, the elevated railroad arose, section by section, above the crowded streets. There was even one little experimental subway tunnel dug under Broadway from Murray Street to Park Place, but it was abandoned as impracticable. In 1870, New York's huge energy found another expression. Work was commenced on the mighty Brooklyn Bridge, and 3 years later, when the city pushed its boundaries northward as far as Yonkers, the need was felt for other bridges to span the Harlem River as well as the East River. Meanwhile, the big town was not neglecting culture. The Metropolitan Museum of Art was founded in 1870, and with the creation of a Board of Education and the voting of school bonds, it became possible to establish normal schools and evening high schools. The Lenox Library was founded, in addition to the Astor Library, which had existed since 1848. And Joseph Jefferson's Rip Van Winkle was attracting crowds to Booth's Theater on 23rd Street. Nor was the exposure of the Tweed Ring the only great newspaper exploit of the day. James Gordon Bennett of the New York Herald financed an African expedition under Henry M. Stanley to search for David Livingstone, the missionary. After thrilling adventures, this expedition accomplished its task in November 1871, thus giving to the world all of Livingstone's maps and journals about that unknown territory. In 1873, New York suffered again from its growing pains, this time provoked by its cultivated sensitiveness to foreign market conditions. South American and Russian wheat began competing with home crops, and with the opening of the Suez Canal, trade routes were upset. Added to these conditions abroad, there was again over-speculation in railroads at home. A panic greater than those which had closed the banks and paralyzed trade in previous years fell upon the city, and this time it took the merchants 10 years to recover from its depressing effect.